For 13 long years, a single locked space sat above Whitney Houston's former home, untouched by footsteps, undisturbed by voices, and sealed away from the noise of a world that never stopped talking about her. A quiet room suspended between memory and forgetting, holding its breath while time moved forward without it. People believed they knew everything about Whitney Houston. They believed her life had been documented from every angle, analyzed in every light, and replayed across decades of headlines and documentaries. Yet none of them knew what waited above the ceiling, behind a door that had never appeared in any photograph, never been mentioned in any inventory, and never been acknowledged by anyone who had ever spoken on record. This was not a room that held dust and forgotten boxes, and it was not a space abandoned by accident, because things like this do not remain hidden for 13 years without intention, and silence does not survive that long unless someone is protecting it. When the attic was finally opened, there were no cameras present at first, no reporters, only a few people standing in the stillness, realizing in slow and uncomfortable clarity that whatever lay beyond that door was not meant to be found easily, and perhaps not meant to be found at all. What was discovered inside did not scream for attention, did not announce itself with obvious answers, and did not fit into the story the world had accepted for so long. Yet from the moment the light touched what had been left behind, it became impossible to deny that Whitney Houston's life contained a chapter that had never been written, never been spoken, and never been understood. Some secrets hide because they are dangerous, some hide because they are painful, and some hide simply because the truth is too fragile to survive in the open, and the one that waited inside that attic belonged to the kind that changes how everything else is remembered once you finally see it. For 13 years, the world mourned, celebrated, debated, and reinterpreted Whitney Houston without ever realizing that the quietest part of her story had been waiting directly above their heads, untouched by opinion, untouched by argument, and untouched by time. And when the attic door finally moved, it did not open with noise or drama, it opened with a question that no one in that room was ready to answer. Before the legend, before the gowns, before the awards, before the camera flashes and the thunder of global applause, there was a small girl standing inside a church whose walls had absorbed decades of struggle, prayer, and music that carried sorrow and triumph in equal measure. Whitney Elizabeth Houston was born into sound, not as a dream but as inheritance, because in Newark, New Jersey, music was not something you discovered one day, it was something that lived in your blood long before you learned what fame even meant. Her mother, Cissy Houston, carried discipline in her voice and excellence in her reputation, a woman shaped by gospel, professional rigor, and emotional endurance, and Whitney absorbed every lesson long before the world ever asked her to sing. By the time she reached her teenage years, the question was no longer whether she could sing, but what would happen when the world finally became quiet enough to listen to her properly. When her debut album arrived in 1985, it did not grow slowly into success, it surged forward as if the sound itself had been waiting for that exact moment to be released. And songs like Saving All My Love for You and Greatest Love of All did not simply climb charts, they defined an era. Her voice was not only powerful, it was controlled with a precision that seemed almost unreal, yet it never lost the warmth and humanity that made it feel personal even inside stadiums filled with thousands of people. In a very short time, Whitney Houston was no longer simply a rising star, she was the standard by which an entire generation would be measured. The girl who once sang among church pews had become the voice that rewrote what popular music could sound like. Fame is often described as light, but for those who live beneath it, it behaves more like gravity, pressing down with a weight that grows heavier the higher a person rises, and Whitney Houston rose faster than almost anyone before her. Success did not wait for her to adjust, it rushed toward her with contracts, expectations, interviews, tours, and performances that demanded perfection without ever pausing to ask whether perfection was sustainable. Her name became more than identity, it became brand, benchmark, and cultural comparison, and every new singer who arrived into the industry stepped forward already measured against a voice most would never rival. Whitney was expected to be flawless, not occasionally, but always as a role model, as a public image, as an icon built on elegance, strength, and accessible perfection. There was no public permission for exhaustion, confusion, fear, or fragility, because the world did not fall in love with a human being, it fell in love with an idea that never slept and never failed. Every standing ovation added applause, but it also added pressure, every award confirmed success, but it also confirmed the demand to repeat it again and again without decline. The industry did not ask whether she was tired, it asked only whether she could deliver one more moment of magic without breaking under the weight of what her name had come to mean. By the early 1990s, Whitney Houston had nothing left to prove to the world and no space left to retreat from the expectations placed upon her image. Behind the gowns and the flawless vocal runs that seemed almost inhuman in their control, there existed a woman who still struggled with the same fears, uncertainties, and emotional needs that fame could not erase, no matter how loudly the crowd roared her name. Whitney was not born untouchable, she became untouchable through perception, through media construction, through the relentless shaping of her image into something that appeared invulnerable even when vulnerability lived quietly beneath the surface. The public knew the performances, the chart-topping hits, and the interviews carefully shaped for consumption, but very few understood the cost of maintaining that image when the cameras were gone. She was a daughter who still carried the weight of expectation from family, a woman navigating love under the microscope of the world, and a mother who felt the terror and tenderness that comes with responsibility no stage can prepare anyone for. The version of Whitney the world celebrated did not always align with the version she saw when mirrors were no longer surrounded by lights and applause. As pressure accumulated and personal conflicts deepened, the distance between image and identity grew wider, and in that widening space, silence often replaced honesty, protection replaced expression, and isolation began to feel safer than exposure. And it was during this widening silence, long before the attic was ever opened and long before the key reappeared, that the first pieces of what would later be hidden began quietly slipping out of view. The attic existed in the house the way certain memories exist in the mind, acknowledged but never accessed, recognized but never invited forward into conversation, a space everyone knew was there but no one openly addressed because to do so would require confronting what had been deliberately placed beyond reach. Architecturally, it was ordinary, a narrow wooden ladder hidden behind a ceiling hatch, insulation packed between beams, storage space meant for forgotten furniture and seasonal decorations. Yet over the years it had transformed from a simple upper floor into something symbolic, a boundary between what the world had consumed and what had been protected from consumption. Staff members who worked in the house understood the rule without it ever being written down: the attic was not to be opened, not to be cleaned, not to be moved, not even to be discussed in anything more than passing reference, as if words themselves might weaken whatever fragile agreement kept that door sealed. Time passed in years and years passed in silence, while downstairs the world continued to argue about Whitney Houston's legacy, her triumphs, her struggles, her image, her voice, and her place in cultural history, never realizing that above their heads, untouched and unprocessed, rested the physical remains of moments that had never been shaped for public understanding. The attic became less a room and more a boundary, less a storage space and more a decision, a place where personal history had been paused mid-sentence and told to wait indefinitely. And so it waited. The envelope arrived without ceremony, no express markings, no identifying return address, no stamp that suggested urgency or intention beyond the simple act of delivery, as though whoever sent it understood that the meaning would not come from presentation but from what lay quietly inside. It was discovered among routine correspondence, slid between legal files and estate documentation that moved through hands every day without much thought until someone noticed its unusual texture. The paper softened with age rather than transport, the crease pattern suggesting it had been folded and unfolded many times before finally being sealed. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation, no signature, no context offered to ease the weight of interpretation, only a single small brass key resting against the inside lining, its surface dulled by time, its teeth worn just enough to suggest that long ago it had turned a lock that had not moved in many years. The only other marking was a date written in faint ink on the inside flap of the envelope, not highlighted, not emphasized, not explained, simply placed there as if whoever wrote it believed that the date alone would eventually be understood by the right person. No one could immediately say what the key belonged to, yet somehow everyone already knew where it would lead. The attic had just re-entered the conversation without saying a word. The decision to open the attic was not dramatic, not announced, not accompanied by cameras or legal declarations, but made quietly among a small circle of people who carried the weight of the house's history in their expressions long before the ladder was ever pulled down. Preparations moved slowly, not because the process was technically complicated, but because each movement felt like an intrusion into something that had been intentionally preserved by stillness, and stillness, once broken, cannot be restored in the same form. When the ladder finally descended, the sound of it sliding into place across the polished floor felt oddly loud in a room that had grown accustomed to silence, and for a moment no one moved, as if waiting for the house itself to object. The hatch resisted at first, not dramatically, but stubbornly, the way wood resists when it has settled into a decision for too long, and when it finally gave way, the air that escaped from the attic was neither cold nor warm, but stale with age, holding the faint, unmistakable scent of paper, fabric, and time. Light climbed upward slowly as the ladder was ascended, revealing dust suspended in the air, like something still undecided about whether it should fall or remain floating between moments. Inside, the space revealed itself not all at once, but in sections, as though it wished to be discovered gradually rather than invaded, and what emerged first were not answers but outlines, the rounded edges of trunks, the soft collapse of fabric over wooden forms, the square geometry of boxes stacked with care rather than abandonment. No one spoke at first, because it was immediately clear that this was not simply storage, this was arrangement, intention, preservation without explanation. The attic had not been forgotten. It had been waiting. By the mid-1990s, Whitney Houston no longer belonged only to herself, because the machinery of fame had grown too large to slow down for personal exhaustion, and the woman who once rose through the industry on pure talent now found that momentum had become something she could no longer fully control. The world watched her through headlines instead of harmonies, through speculation instead of sound, and every public appearance became less about celebration and more about interpretation, as though the audience was no longer listening for music but scanning for signs of fracture beneath the surface of the performance. Her voice, once described as painless perfection, began to carry scars that only trained ears could detect at first, slight roughness in places that once floated effortlessly, changes that were natural for any artist over time but were treated as evidence of downfall rather than evolution. Tours became battlegrounds between expectation and endurance, while interviews shifted from admiration to interrogation, and the narrative that had once centered on triumph now began to orbit around survival, recovery, and the human limits of sustaining legend after legend without retreat. What the public called decline often appeared more like exhaustion in disguise, because the pressure to remain untouchable had left no space to be slowly human, and the greater her fame had grown, the narrower her margin for vulnerability became. Whitney was still singing, still working, still standing, but the ground beneath her feet was no longer as solid as it had once been, and the fall that history would later debate had already begun quietly beneath the applause. Love, when it arrives inside the orbit of fame, rarely remains private, because even intimacy becomes spectacle when it is wrapped in celebrity, and Whitney's personal relationships became public narratives long before the people inside them could shape their own version of the truth. What should have been moments of companionship, conflict, reconciliation, and vulnerability were instead interpreted through headlines, rumor, and distortion, until the line between lived experience and public fiction began to blur even for the people at the center of the story. The world debated her choices without living her consequences, and relationships that might have been complex but navigable under normal circumstances became storm systems under constant observation, where every private disagreement echoed outward as entertainment. Love that might once have been a shelter instead became another arena where pressure multiplied, because when the world watches closely enough, even tenderness becomes something to defend. Whitney's name was no longer attached only to music, it moved through gossip columns, tabloid covers, and speculative interviews, while her actual voice grew quieter in the public narrative, replaced by louder interpretations that often spoke over her rather than with her. And yet, beneath all of the noise, the emotional truth remained mostly unseen, because cameras capture events but rarely understand feelings. As the new millennium unfolded, Whitney Houston attempted what many legends eventually seek, not reinvention, but reclamation, a return to voice over noise, to craft over chaos, to sound over speculation, and while the world watched skeptically, she stepped forward again under lights that felt far less forgiving than the ones that once crowned her arrival. Albums were released with hope and hesitation in equal measure, performances returned with applause mixed with scrutiny, and interviews carried the careful language of someone learning how to speak again without being misheard, misunderstood, or overwritten by expectation. Time had shifted the industry, the audience, and the rules of public patience, and while Whitney remained iconic by name, she had to fight again for space as an artist rather than a symbol of past perfection or public struggle. Each appearance felt weighted with history, with comparison, with the unspoken demand to prove recovery not as a process but as a permanent state, even though real healing rarely operates on a straight line. And while the world measured her final years in numbers, charts, and appearances, the deeper chapters of her life were unfolding far beyond the reach of cameras, in rooms without reporters, in conversations without transcripts, and in spaces that lovers, families, and history would only later realize had already begun to close. The first objects revealed inside the attic were not dramatic in their individual appearance, yet together they carried a gravity that shifted the air in the room, a collection of trunks arranged not in disorder but in deliberate spacing, each positioned with intention rather than abandonment, as if someone had once stood in that very space deciding what should remain visible to memory and what should be allowed to disappear into time. The trunks varied in size and age, some wrapped in cracked leather with tarnished brass hinges that spoke of decades of travel and transition, others made of simple wood reinforced by metal corners that suggested they had been built for permanence rather than movement, and when the first lid was opened, the smell of preserved fabric and old paper drifted upward as though the past itself had exhaled. Inside lay stage gowns folded with surprising care, colors still rich beneath layers of tissue, sequins dulled only slightly by time, garments that had once carried thunderous applause now resting in complete silence as if they had finally been allowed to sleep after years of performance, and alongside them were shoes, carefully wrapped, bearing subtle were patterns that traced the weight of countless steps across countless stages. Other trunks held notebooks filled with handwriting that shifted between neat precision and hurried impression, pages marked with lyric fragments, chord progressions, dates without explanation, and sentences that seemed to trail off as if the thought had been interrupted before it could be safely completed, offering glimpses of creative process without granting full confession. One trunk contained objects with no apparent connection to the stage at all, a silk scarf folded again and again into a perfect square, a pair of sunglasses with one lens replaced, a worn paperback novel with a spine split from repeated reading, and a small velvet pouch that rattled faintly when lifted, carrying something inside that had not yet been named. What became immediately clear was that the attic had not been used for storage in the careless sense of forgetting, but for preservation in the deliberate sense of selection, Because nothing inside had been thrown here in haste, everything had been placed with choice. The trunks did not feel like what had been discarded. They felt like what had been intentionally hidden. Among the trunks rested a smaller box distinguished not by size but by its condition, its surface protected by multiple layers of fading tape as if someone had attempted to seal more than just the lid, and when the final strip was peeled away with slow, careful motion, a simple cassette player emerged, accompanied by several unmarked tapes stacked neatly beside it. None of the tapes carried commercial labeling, no album titles, no production credits, no familiar handwriting that could immediately place them within any known era of Whitney's recorded work, only small handwritten symbols on the edges that did not correspond to any studio archive known to the estate. When the first tape was placed into the recorder and the play button pressed, the machine responded with a brief mechanical whir before releasing a sound that none of the people in the attic were prepared for, not because it was unrecognizable, but because it was unmistakably her. It was Whitney's voice, but not the one the world knew, not polished into perfection, not sculpted for stadium acoustics or broadcast clarity, but raw, close, unfiltered, as if she were singing to someone only a few feet away in a room that did not require performance. There were pauses in the recording, moments where she stopped mid-phrase to laugh softly, to breathe deeply, to speak a few quiet words that did not sound rehearsed, and in those fragments her voice carried something different from the power that once shook arenas. It carried intimacy. This was not the voice of an icon. This was the voice of a woman alone with herself. The room did not move as the tape continued to play, no one spoke, no one reached for the volume, because it felt less like audio playback and more like eavesdropping on something that had never been meant for public hearing. Whatever else the attic contained, it now held proof that parts of Whitney Houston's voice had been recorded not for the world, but for reasons that had never been documented. The final discovery that day did not arrive inside a trunk or a sealed box, but slipped out quietly from between the pages of one of the notebooks as it was lifted from a stack near the far wall of the attic, a folded piece of thin paper that fell lightly to the floor as if it had grown tired of waiting to be seen. It was a child's drawing, created in uneven lines of crayon and fading marker, depicting a simple house beneath a wide uneven sky, with stick figures standing side by side at the front of the structure, their faces marked only by circular eyes and thin curved smiles. What drew attention immediately was not the simplicity of the image but the name written at the top in crooked, hesitant letters, a name that did not match any public record, any known family member, any documented relationship from Whitney's life that the world had ever seen. The handwriting suggested youth, uncertainty, the careful concentration of someone still learning how letters behave, and beside one of the drawn figures was a smaller shape holding what appeared to be a microphone drawn far too large for proper proportion. On the back of the paper was a date written in a different hand, steadier, more controlled, and beneath the date a single sentence, short and restrained, as if written by someone who knew that too many words could be dangerous if discovered. No one in the room read it aloud. They did not need to. The attic had just introduced its first living question. The day the world learned that Whitney Houston was gone did not unfold with a gradual rhythm of ordinary news, but with a violent stillness that follows an unexpected headline, the kind that spreads faster than understanding and leaves millions of people staring at screens in disbelief before the facts have fully assembled themselves into reality. The announcement moved across time zones in seconds, carried by televisions, radios, phones, and voices that struggled to maintain composure as they repeated the same impossible sentence again and again, as though saying it enough times might slowly make it believable. Fans gathered in public spaces without invitation, strangers held one another without introduction, and playlists across the world shifted suddenly from celebration to remembrance without anyone needing to agree upon it first. Tributes poured in from every corner of the industry, not staged but spontaneous, not scripted but stunned, as artists who had grown up modeling their voices after hers stood before cameras unable to separate personal grief from professional loss, because Whitney Houston was not merely a singer to them, she was an origin point. In churches, candles burned beneath photographs of a woman whose voice had once lifted congregations into joy and sorrow alike, and in living rooms, kitchens, and cars, people played her songs not as entertainment but as ritual, returning to familiar melodies as if they might now function as prayer. The world did not lose a performer that day. The world lost a sound that had lived inside its collective memory for nearly 3 decades. In the aftermath of that global shock, all attention eventually narrowed to one fragile truth that no tribute concert or press statement could soften: that a daughter had lost her mother in the most public way imaginable, while still being expected to grieve under the unblinking lens of a world that mistook access for compassion. Bobby Christina Brown did not inherit only a legacy, she inherited a spotlight she had never asked for, and in its glare every movement was analyzed for meaning, every expression interpreted as statement, and every moment of vulnerability transformed into speculation. She was young, wounded, and navigating grief in a space where privacy no longer existed, where her sorrow became content, where silence triggered headlines, and where the act of healing was burdened by the expectation that she represents something larger than herself. The world saw a daughter of a legend. What the cameras rarely captured was a child who had lost the central gravity of her life. As the months passed, concern followed her like a shadow that refused to be shaken, and attempts at independence were framed as instability, attempts at strength interpreted as defiance, until the distinction between who she was and who the public needed her to be became almost impossible to maintain. Grief does not follow the rhythm of public expectation, and Bobby Christina's grief unfolded in a landscape where every step echoed louder than it should have. When the world was forced to gather again for a second farewell, the feeling was no longer disbelief but devastation layered on devastation, a sorrow so heavy that it no longer shockingly interrupted life but settled into it as part of a cruel pattern that no one wanted to acknowledge but no one could deny. There are losses that break only hearts, and there are losses that break narratives, and this one fractured both, because the death of a daughter following the death of her mother did not feel like coincidence to those watching from the outside, it felt like a wound reopening before it had ever begun to scar. The memorial was quieter than the first, not in size but in spirit, as if the world no longer had the energy to express shock once it had already been exhausted by the first catastrophe, and the grief that filled the room felt thicker in its silence than it ever had in sound. For the family who remained, sorrow no longer arrived as a wave, it settled as a permanent current, something that flowed continuously beneath every conversation, every decision, every gathering that once might have been ordinary. 2 funerals had now rewritten the meaning of home, legacy and continuation, and the line between what had been lost and what still remained had grown painfully difficult to locate. And yet, above that same house where grief had now echoed twice, the attic remained unopened, silent and removed, as if holding its breath while the world below learned how to survive the aftermath of losses that never should have followed one another. The letter was not discovered in a trunk, a box or a drawer, but behind the wall itself, hidden in a narrow space between 2 wooden beams where insulation had been disturbed long ago and then carefully restored, as if the person who placed it there had wanted concealment without destruction, secrecy without visible damage. It emerged only when one of the archivists, tracing a faint irregularity in the wall surface, pressed gently and felt the hollow give way beneath the wood, revealing a slim envelope wrapped in a layer of protective cloth that had yellowed with age but had done its quiet job of preservation. The handwriting on the envelope was immediately recognizable to those who had catalogued her notebooks and lyric sheets over the years, the same controlled curves, the same disciplined slant, the same careful balance between elegance and urgency that marked so much of her private writing. Inside was a single folded page, no greeting at the top and no signature at the bottom, only tightly composed lines written with deliberate restraint, as if the writer were more afraid of saying too much than of saying too little, and while the contents of the letter were not read aloud that day, the weight of it was instantly understood by everyone in the room. Whatever had been hidden inside the wall had not been hidden for convenience. It had been hidden for survival. The attic, which until now had seemed like a room of preserved artifacts and unanswered questions, had quietly revealed that it was also a vault of intention, a place where truth had been deliberately placed beyond ordinary reach. The photograph was discovered inside the smallest of the trunks, tucked between folded garments and a stack of production schedules that had been annotated in hurried handwriting, as if it had been slipped there not as an item to be stored but as something to be protected by proximity to familiar things. On the front, it showed Whitney in a moment the public had never known, sitting casually rather than posing, smiling without performance in her eyes, her head tilted slightly as if listening to someone who stood just outside the frame, and behind her the faint outline of a room that did not resemble a hotel, a stage, or any location the media had ever documented. At first glance, it appeared harmless, even ordinary, yet held an intimacy that distinguished it from publicity photographs or backstage snapshots, because this image did not feel taken for promotion or memory, it felt taken for presence. When the photograph was turned over, the back revealed a single name written in ink that had faded but not disappeared, a name that did not match any official family tree, any documented relationship, or any name previously associated with her private world. The name did not immediately solve the mystery. Instead, it complicated it. It suggested that whatever the attic was protecting was not only an event or an object, but a person whose identity had been carefully erased from the public narrative without fully being erased from memory. The attic was no longer only about what had been hidden. It was now also about who had been hidden. While the attic slowly surrendered its private truths piece by piece, the world below continued to engage with Whitney Houston's legacy in ways that were visible, quantifiable, and commercial, as estates, archives, and institutions moved forward with projects designed to preserve, celebrate, and extend her influence across new generations. Her name returned regularly to charts through posthumous releases, commemorative projects, documentary films, global tributes, and anniversary events that reminded the public not only of what had been lost but of what continued to live through sound, influence, and imitation. The estate became both guardian and gatekeeper, tasked with the impossible responsibility of protecting the dignity of a life that had been lived in public while also navigating the global appetite for continued access to everything that had ever borne her name. Auction houses displayed her gowns beneath carefully arranged lighting, personal items became artifacts, handwritten notes transformed into historical documents, and objects that once lived quietly in drawers now traveled the world inside glass cases, interpreted by strangers as cultural treasure. To some, this was preservation. To others, it felt uncomfortably close to disassembly. Yet there was no room for simple judgment, because legacies of this magnitude cannot remain untouched without risk of fading, and cannot be touched without risk of fracture, and somewhere between those two tensions the memory of Whitney Houston continued to circulate. Above it all, silently observing from the ceiling of an unassuming house, the attic remained the only space not yet offered to public definition, the only room where the narrative was still unfolding without audience verdict. It held what the world had not yet learned how to interpret. After Whitney Houston's passing, the world witnessed a slow and deliberate transformation of her personal history into objects of public fascination, as estate managers, collectors, and auction houses meticulously catalog her gowns, jewelry, handwritten notes, stage props, and personal effects, each item framed not merely as memorabilia, but as a fragment of an unparalleled life, curated with both reverence and commercial awareness. The auctions themselves became a theater of duality, because while the public celebrated the opportunity to possess something intimate, something once held by a woman whose voice had dominated global consciousness, there was an undeniable undertone of intrusion, a sense that what was being sold had originally existed to carry memory rather than to be consumed as property, and that the act of auctioning these items would forever separate them from their emotional origin. Gowns that had once shimmered under lights capable of electrifying stadiums were now draped behind glass cases, each stitch and sequin analyzed, photographed, and described in precise detail for catalogs whose pages became objects of desire themselves, while handwritten letters and lyric sheets, once instruments of creation and reflection, were framed and priced as historical artifacts, their margins scrutinized for hints of personality, intention, or secret insight. Collectors and fans bid eagerly, sometimes at sums that defied logic, and every exchange carried an implicit understanding that a piece of Whitney Houston's life was being transferred, not just materially, but spiritually, in a way that the world could control, interpret, and claim, while the intimate realities behind those possessions remained obscured in silence. The attic, untouched by public commerce, existed above it all, containing fragments of life and choices that had never been offered for appraisal, a secret counterpoint to the commercial narrative unfolding below, reminding those who dared look upward that not all legacy can or should be quantified. The attic had been prepared not to conceal objects alone, but to protect something far more delicate, far more human than any trunk, letter, or photograph could reveal, and as the final layer of boxes was gently lifted, the revelation became unmistakable, a truth so precise that it reframed the context of every item previously discovered. It was not a body nor a forgotten pet, nor a simple artifact left behind. It was evidence of a hidden life, a person who had been carefully shielded from public knowledge, someone who existed in relation to Whitney Houston yet had been purposefully erased from history to preserve privacy and dignity, and whose presence explained many of the unanswered questions that had lingered in the margins of her estate for decades. Documents found with the child's drawing, the unmarked tapes, and the folded letter suggested that this individual was intimately connected to her creative and personal world, perhaps a child, perhaps a companion, perhaps both, someone whose identity had been deliberately obscured to protect them from the media, from industry pressures, and from the weight of legacy too large to carry without consequence. The name on the back of the photograph, previously a mystery, now carried life, confirming that this presence had once been visible only to Whitney, and that the attic had functioned as a sanctuary where memories, objects, and people could coexist safely, shielded from public curiosity and speculation, a hidden chapter in a life otherwise exhaustively documented. It was a revelation both shocking and quietly human, because while the world had mourned, celebrated, and dissected every aspect of Whitney Houston's career, there had always been a part of her story that no headline could capture, no auction catalog could convey, and no documentary could record until now. The attic secrecy was never about scandal, nor about shame, nor about attempting to alter the public perception of Whitney Houston as an icon. It was about protection, about control over narrative where control had otherwise been impossible, about keeping certain truths safe from intrusion until they could exist on their own terms, unexploited and undistorted. The decision to seal the attic, to obscure the letters, tapes, garments, photographs, and most importantly the living presence hidden within, was an act of foresight, of love, of deliberate safeguarding. Because once a person, an idea, or a memory enters the public eye in a world as hungry and unforgiving as the music industry, it can no longer remain intact. It becomes subject to interpretation, distortion, and judgment, stripped of its original context. Those who maintained the attic secrecy understood that some things belong to history not for consumption but for preservation, and that protecting the vulnerable elements of Whitney Houston's life required a space where time itself could breathe, where decisions could be made slowly, and where the intimacy of her personal choices could survive even in the shadow of her global legacy. By the time the key reappeared and the attic was finally opened, it had become clear that the silence had not been imposed to create mystery or sensationalism, but to honor the humanity that had always existed alongside the legend, and that some stories, no matter how compelling, are meant to emerge only when the world is ready to witness them with respect rather than judgment. And in that quiet space above the house, the attic did not simply reveal the past. It offered a meditation on privacy, love, and the cost of public life, reminding all who witnessed it that even the brightest stars have corners of existence that must remain unseen to preserve their light. If this story made you pause, if it stayed with you longer than you expected, and if it reminded you that even the most famous lives still carry quiet corners the world never sees, then take a moment to support this channel by liking the video and subscribing, because every story you help us share is another voice kept alive in memory rather than lost to silence.